A black man boarded his flight, quiet and calm. 30 minutes later, a white woman pressed the call button, saying she didn't feel safe. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved. But somehow, he was the threat. What happened next? It wasn't about him. It was about all of us. She didn't flinch when a man once screamed at her in a parking lot. Didn't blink when a hurricane tore through her hometown in '89. But the moment she stepped onto that plane and saw a black man in her row, alone, silent, unreadable, her chest tightened like a warning siren. That moment didn't come from danger. It came from a story she didn't know she'd been telling herself for 56 years. Amelia Jones had raised 2 children, managed corporate teams, and voted in favor of diversity bills. She'd said all the right things at dinner parties, but deep down, beneath the good manners and the better intentions, there lived a quiet belief. Some people just felt wrong. At 7:02 a.m., gate C-28, she hung up on her daughter after a bitter call about race and fear. 20 minutes later, she'd lean toward a stranger and say, "Are you sure this is your seat?" And that lie she'd lived inside, it cracked wide open. The morning sun hadn't fully risen when Amelia Jones found herself arguing with her daughter in the passenger drop-off lane outside Concourse C. Car doors slammed, suitcases clattered, and the world moved around her. But she stood still, phone pressed to her ear, voice tight. "You don't get it," she said, jaw clenched. "The world isn't as safe as you think it is." Her daughter's voice cracked back, urgent and raw. "No, Mom, you don't get it. What do you call being careful? That's fear, dressed up in manners." Silence. Then the line went dead. Amelia stood there for a long moment, staring into nothing, holding the phone like it had betrayed her. Then she turned, heels clicking sharply against the concrete, and walked inside the terminal. Everything felt too bright, too cold. She moved through TSA like a machine, passport, shoes, belt, automatic. But her mind kept circling the same thought. She'd survived a lot and raised 2 kids, navigated men who talked over her in boardrooms, watched friends lose homes, jobs, dignity. She knew how to read people. She knew who was safe, or so she believed. Until that morning. Until the second she walked down the aisle of Flight 482 and saw him, row 29, left side, window seat. A black man, alone. No smile, no small talk, just presence. And something in her chest shifted, not because he'd done anything, because of what she saw when she looked at him, and worse, because of what she didn't. The air inside the cabin was cooler than expected, sterile, humming with recycled pressure and the low murmur of passengers settling in. Amelia moved slowly down the aisle, scanning numbers like always, a ritual more about control than direction. Row 29. She reached it and stopped. He was already there. Seat 29A. Left window. Hoodie pulled snug across his shoulders, dark skin catching the faint overhead light, a canvas bag tucked under his feet. He didn't look up. No nod, no smile, just stillness. Her body hesitated before her mind could name why. She double-checked her boarding pass, though she didn't need to. The seat beside him was hers. 29C. She slipped in, carefully, like placing herself beside a sleeping dog she wasn't sure would bite. He didn't turn. She cleared her throat, adjusted her coat. Then she leaned ever so slightly toward him, because she couldn't not. "Excuse me," she said, polite but pointed. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Only then did he move. Slowly, calmly. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out his ticket, and replied without looking at her. "Yes, 29A, Omari Ellis." He said it without defense, without offense, like a man who'd answered this question before. Amelia blinked, forced a smile, nodded once. But something in her gut wouldn't let go. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't do. She turned toward the window, heart thudding louder than the engine, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was the one reading the room. She felt like maybe this time, she was the one being read. She tried to distract herself, pulled out a paperback she'd been meaning to start, thumbed through the first few lines, but the words sat flat on the page. She wasn't reading. She was listening. To him, or rather, to his quiet. There was no phone in his hand, no earbuds in his ears, no idle tapping, no cough, no sigh. Just breathe, deep, measured, and maddeningly calm. He was still staring forward, unmoved, as if nothing outside that seat could touch him. And that bothered her more than if he'd scowled, fidgeted, or spoken, because it felt intentional, not rude, not warm, just untouchable. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her bag so it didn't touch his. Her elbow grazed the shared armrest, and for a split second, her skin touched his. She pulled back like it burned. He didn't flinch. That, more than anything, set her on edge. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, searching for a flight attendant. She wasn't sure why. She didn't need anything. But something about his stillness made her feel like she did. It wasn't that he looked dangerous. It was that she couldn't read him. And for a woman like Amelia, being unable to read someone was worse than any overt threat. It meant she had no control over the story her instincts were trying to write. She took another breath, shallow this time, then glanced sideways again. Still no phone, still no reaction. Just a man in a hoodie, in his rightful seat, doing nothing at all. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, she was already writing the next scene. And in her version, he was the problem. The plane was still boarding. Voices filled the aisle, polite greetings, rustling coats, the clunk of overhead bins being slammed shut. Amelia sat frozen in that soundscape, but her mind was entirely elsewhere. She could feel her breath shortening, though nothing had changed. Nothing. Except the man next to her, who still hadn't spoken, still hadn't moved, not once. She'd spent her life learning how to sense when something was off. She wasn't the nervous type. She was, if anything, overly prepared. She knew how to read a room and spot a mismatch. And something here felt wrong. The bag at his feet was zipped tight, the kind you could slide a laptop into, or anything. He hadn't opened it once, glanced at it, or explained a thing. She'd asked if this was his seat. He'd answered. But now the question echoed again in her chest, with another meaning beneath it. Was he supposed to be here? Not just in this seat, on this flight, in this space, next to her. She glanced down the aisle. A flight attendant was assisting a mother in settling her child. Amelia raised her hand slightly, barely a motion, but enough. The flight attendant noticed, smiled, walked over. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Amelia gave a soft, polite laugh, restrained. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," she said. I don't feel very comfortable in this seat." The words were light, civil, but they carried something heavier. A charge in the air, a familiar social code, unspoken but understood. The flight attendant blinked, Her smile tightened just enough to register the shift. She glanced at the man in 29A. Still quiet. Still calm. But now, the story was no longer just in Amelia's head. It had entered the cabin. The flight attendant, a woman in her early 30s with steady hands and tired eyes, tilted her head just enough to show she was listening, but not yet alarmed. "Is there an issue with the seat itself?" she asked gently. Amelia hesitated, eyes flicking toward the bag under Omari's feet, then quickly back up. "No," she said, voice soft but deliberate. "Not the seat. It's just, I don't know. I'm feeling a little uneasy." The attendant's smile faded slightly. Not rude, just aware. She turned to Omari. "Sir, would you mind confirming your boarding pass?" He didn't sigh, and he didn't look surprised. He reached calmly into his jacket and handed it over without a word. She scanned it. 29A. All good, she said quietly, more to Amelia than to him. Omari returned the pass. Still didn't speak. Amelia nodded, lips pressed into a thin, practiced smile. "I suppose that settles it," she murmured, but her tone said otherwise. The attendant paused momentarily, as if weighing something invisible, then said, "Let me know if you need anything else," and walked away. But others had noticed. Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy blazer subtly turned his head, pretending to check his watch while listening. A row behind, someone lowered their book just enough to peek. The hum of small talk had dulled. There was no accusation, no raised voice, no scene, just a stillness that had changed in texture. Omari shifted slightly in his seat, barely, but it was the first movement he'd made in minutes. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. And for the first time, Amelia realized she wasn't sure what she was waiting for either. But the cabin was. Amelia sat still, her back stiff against the upright seat and her hands folded tight in her lap. Her breath was measured now, too measured. Each inhale was a decision, and each exhale was a performance. The smile she'd worn was gone. She didn't feel silly. She felt certain. This wasn't right. She'd flown first class, economy, regional jets, and long hauls. She'd sat beside crying babies, men who talked too much, couples who argued. But this was something else. The man beside her wasn't doing anything wrong. But that, she thought, was part of the problem. He wasn't doing anything. And that silence had started to feel like a dare. She pressed the call button again. The soft chime overhead was barely audible, but its echo felt louder than it should have. A few heads turned. One person, 2 rows ahead, shifted in their seat. The same flight attendant returned, her eyes now a shade more cautious. "Yes, ma'am?" Amelia leaned in slightly, voice lower than before. "I'd like to request a seat change," she said, with the kind of gentleness reserved for hotel lobbies and prayer circles. The attendant blinked. "Is something wrong with the seat itself?" "No." Amelia hesitated for a beat. "I just don't feel comfortable. I prefer to sit elsewhere." Her words were calm, measured, carefully crafted to say just enough and nothing concrete. The attendant didn't respond right away. She glanced at Omari, whose eyes remained on the back of the seat before him. No reaction, no protest, just presence. "I'll check for availability," she said softly, tapping her tablet. And as she walked away, Amelia exhaled, not with relief, but with a sense of control. She wasn't done. Not yet. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later, tablet in hand, lips pursed. She paused beside the row, eyes scanning the data on the screen more than she needed to. Stalling, perhaps. Amelia looked up expectantly, uncrossing her legs as if preparing to stand. "I'm afraid," the attendant said softly, "we're at full capacity today. There are no open seats in first class." Amelia's face twitched. Not disappointment, not surprise, but calculation. "And in economy?" she asked, tone light, almost breezy. The attendant blinked, then checked again. "Two available, middle seats, toward the rear." Amelia nodded, as though weighing options that had already been decided. "Perfect," she said. "He can take one of them." That word, he, hung in the air like smoke. The attendant tilted slightly, as if to confirm she'd heard right. "Just to clarify," she said, her voice firmer now, "would you like me to move this passenger? Because you're uncomfortable?" Amelia smiled again, but the edges didn't reach her eyes. "I think it would be best for everyone," she said carefully. "It's not personal." But across the aisle, a man with a Bluetooth earpiece let out a quiet snort. A woman 2 rows back raised her phone, not to scroll, but to record. And in that instant, the tone of the cabin shifted. What had been private was now public. What had been politeness was now posture. The attendant didn't move. Her fingers hovered over her tablet. Her eyes no longer flicked between passenger names. They locked onto Amelia's. And somewhere behind them, the silence grew heavier. Amelia shifted in her seat and pressed the call button again. This time, the soft chime was subtle but felt like a siren. The flight attendant paused before responding, as if she knew what was coming. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, voice neutral. Amelia sat straighter, hands folded, expression calm. Too calm. "I need to speak to someone in charge," she said, her voice slightly louder. "The lead crew member, or the captain, if necessary." A soft murmur rippled through the nearby rows. Someone coughed. Someone else stopped typing mid-email. The attendant blinked. "Ma'am, the captain is currently preparing for takeoff. I'm the lead on this flight. Is there something I can help clarify?" Amelia's jaw tightened. "I don't feel safe," she said. The words landed like a dropped knife, not screamed, not even emphasized, but chosen carefully, surgically. Omari didn't move. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, slowly, hands still folded, shoulders relaxed, entirely still. Across the aisle, the man with the earpiece whispered, "Here we go." 3 rows back, a teenager lowered her hoodie and held up her phone, no longer hiding it. The attendant stood a little taller. Her tone cooled just a degree. "Ma'am, are you saying you feel threatened?" Amelia tilted her head and gave a small, tight smile. "I'm not saying that," she replied. "I just don't feel comfortable. That's all." But it wasn't all. It never is. And everyone in that cabin knew it. The words lingered, not loud, not frantic, but sharp enough to slice through the recycled air. "I don't feel safe." That sentence had power. Everyone knew it. The flight attendant didn't respond right away. Her body stilled, eyes flicking to Omari, then back to Amelia, as if calculating something far heavier than seating logistics. Omari remained motionless. His hands rested gently on his lap. His posture spoke of patience, but not submission. He wasn't waiting for permission. He was waiting for the next move. A few rows back, a woman whispered to her husband. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward slightly to ensure he heard correctly. Amelia straightened her scarf. "I'm not accusing him," she added quickly, voice honeyed. "It would be safer for everyone if someone else took that seat." The words were smooth, rehearsed in 100 polite boardroom tones. but their meaning was unmistakable. The flight attendant's mouth formed a neutral line. "Ma'am," she said, "you're asking me to move a passenger in his assigned seat who has done nothing wrong and hasn't spoken a word to you." Amelia hesitated. Her fingers curled around the edge of her armrest. "I'm asking to feel safe," she repeated. A teenager behind them let out a breathless scoff. From Omari, nothing. No eye contact. No retort. But it was his silence that screamed the loudest. And now, finally, the cabin was listening. Not to Amelia, but to what she wasn't saying. The silence grew thicker, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed with tension, with held breath and unspoken judgment. The flight attendant stood straighter now, shoulders squared, voice steadier. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "we do not relocate passengers based on discomfort alone. Mr. Ellis is in the correct seat and has followed every protocol." Amelia opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. She wasn't used to resistance, not like this. "Then check the back of the plane," she said at last, tone clipped. "I'm willing to move if that's easier for everyone." There it was again. That word. Everyone. The attendant tapped her tablet, slightly paused, then looked up. "There are 2 open middle seats in economy," she said. "Row 34 and 35. Amelia nodded sharply. "That will work." But before the attendant could respond, a quiet voice finally filled the space between them. Omari turned and looked Amelia in the eye, not with anger or accusation, but with clarity. He reached slowly into his inner pocket. From it, he pulled a leather case, opened it. A flash of gold caught the cabin light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The word said more than he ever had. A ripple moved through the aisle, murmurs, widened eyes, shifting bodies. One woman gasped audibly. A man 2 rows up let out a quiet, "Well, damn." Omari didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, calm and measured, "Ma'am, would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." Amelia's face drained of color, and for the first time, she realized she hadn't just made a mistake. She'd built a whole story, without knowing a single page of his. The badge stayed open for a second longer, long enough for everyone nearby to register what it meant. Not speculation, not suspicion. Federal agent. Then Omari closed the leather case with the same calm he'd carried since boarding. He placed it gently on his lap. He didn't look triumphant, just finished. Amelia's mouth opened, then closed. Her breath stuttered. Her face had gone pale, but her hands remained clenched on the armrests, as if still bracing for impact that had already hit. She looked around. The businessman across the aisle was staring, his jaw set. The teenage girl 3 rows back was still recording, her phone angled just low enough to feign discretion. 2 passengers whispered behind cupped hands. A quiet ripple of shame moved through the air. It was hers alone. The flight attendant didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her posture said everything, professional still, but something behind her eyes had shifted, disappointment maybe, or simply clarity. Amelia blinked rapidly. She began, then stopped. No sentence could contain what she'd done. She hadn't yelled, hadn't cursed, and hadn't threatened. But she had tried to remove a man from his seat who had done nothing, based on the discomfort of her narrative. And that story had collapsed in the public eye. Across the aisle, the man with the Bluetooth whispered, not to anyone in particular, "They always say it's not about race, until the badge comes out." Omari turned toward the window, said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The cabin had quieted, not as planes do before takeoff, but in a way that felt intentional and watchful. The silence that follows when people know they've just witnessed something no one can unsee. Amelia sat still, her spine rigid, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her throat felt tight. The air is too thin. Or maybe that was just her body trying to catch up with what her mind already knew. She had lost control. No seat change, no validation, no quiet nod from authority that she was right to be concerned. Instead, she was now why a federal agent flashed his badge on a Tuesday morning flight to Chicago. And she hadn't just been wrong. She had been seen doing something wrong. Omari hadn't spoken another word. He didn't need to. He had returned to his seat, reopened the book he hadn't touched before, and turned a page as if the last 10 minutes had never happened. That, more than anything, shredded her composure. She glanced around, searching for refuge, an ally, a sympathetic look. There was none. The businessman across the aisle had returned to his newspaper, but his brow was still furrowed. The teenage girl was no longer filming, but her phone was resting on her leg, the screen still recording, and the red dot blinking softly. Even the flight attendants moved differently now, quieter, less attentive, not cruel, just distant, as if they were saying, without saying, "You've shown us who you are, and now we know." Amelia blinked hard, willing herself not to cry. She'd once said tears were for people who didn't plan well enough. But there, in seat 29C, she sat planning nothing, just replaying everything. The flight hadn't even left the ground, and somehow she had already arrived at the worst version of herself. The plane began to taxi, slowly crawling toward the runway. Engines murmured with gathering force, and overhead bins hummed as if holding their breath. Seatbelt signs lit up, phones clicked off. The usual choreography of departure unfolded, but for Amelia, the rhythm felt wrong. She was still, but not steady, buckled in, but unanchored. Her hands sat in her lap, fingers laced so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Across the aisle, people had resumed conversations in hushed tones, some pretending nothing had happened, others digesting what they'd seen. But no one looked at her now. No one smiled politely, no small talk. She had become the thing people didn't want to acknowledge in daylight. Her ears popped as the cabin pressurized, but she hardly noticed. Her attention was locked inward. Omari hadn't moved, and hadn't even glanced her way. He flipped a page in his book, his body completely relaxed, as if he were used to this. It was as if this wasn't the first time someone tried to make him smaller in public, and it wouldn't be the last. That realization sank hard. She had reduced him to a threat, not because of anything he did, not because of any word he spoke, but because of the story she carried about men who looked like him. A story passed down, dressed in careful language, reinforced by news cycles, family warnings, and polite avoidance, a tale she never questioned, until now. The plane tilted, gaining speed. Wheels thundered against the runway. Gravity fought back, but flight won. They lifted. And yet, Amelia remained grounded, pinned to the seat not by physics, but by the weight of self-recognition. The higher they rose, the smaller everything looked outside, except for her shame. That only grew larger. The plane had leveled out above the clouds. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Passengers began to move, stretching, reaching for magazines, ordering drinks. The cabin felt lighter, but not for Amelia. She hadn't moved. Omari still hadn't looked at her, and yet somehow She felt more seen than ever. She turned her head slightly, not all the way, just enough. "I owe you an apology," she said, voice low. "Not because of your badge, because I should have known better before that." Omari didn't answer, didn't react. She took a steadier breath. "I thought I was being cautious, but really, I was reacting to something I never questioned in myself, and I'm sorry for that." Still silence. She glanced over now, fully, and found him watching her. His face didn't carry anger. It carried time. Time spent being doubted, dismissed, and disarmed by words like, "just uncomfortable." "You're not the first," he said quietly, "and I doubt you'll be the last." His tone wasn't sharp. It was matter of fact, like someone naming the weather, a condition expected, endured. Amelia nodded slowly. "But maybe I can be the last one in my family." That made him blink. "My daughter," she added, "has been trying to tell me for years. I shut her down. I thought I was protecting her from the world. But now I see I was passing something down." Omari looked out the window. His voice, when it returned, was softer. "Then don't pass it. Interrupt it." Amelia swallowed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the one holding wisdom. She felt like a student, and for once she didn't mind the lesson. Omari didn't speak right away. He just looked out the window, the clouds casting soft shadows on his face. When he finally turned back to her, his eyes weren't angry. They were tired, but not weak. "I've flown over 50 times this year," he said. "You'd be surprised how often this kind of thing happens before wheels even leave the ground." Amelia listened. Sometimes it's a side glance. Sometimes it's a woman clutching her purse. Once, a man asked to be receipted because I didn't smile when he said good morning. He gave a faint laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've had TSA swab my hands twice in 1 week. I've had people ask me what I really do for a living, even after showing them credentials. Amelia's lips parted, but she didn't speak. "I don't get mad anymore," he said, "because anger makes people like you nervous. And once you're nervous, I'm dangerous." That landed. He looked at her directly now. "So I stay calm, measured, predictable. I speak with tone and posture in mind. I've learned to exist in a way that doesn't make others uncomfortable, even if I'm humiliated." Amelia felt something tighten in her chest. "I used to think dignity was about how you held your head high," he continued. "But for people like me, it's also about what you choose not to say, what you swallow, what you let pass." He paused. "But that doesn't mean it doesn't cost us." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane adjusted altitude. A quiet hum surrounded them, but clarity had settled between their seats. "I don't want your apology," he said gently. "I want you to tell this story, not because I need sympathy, but because someone else needs to hear it before they do what you almost did." Amelia blinked back the sting in her eyes. She had asked for a seat change, but somewhere mid-air, it was her perspective that had shifted. The captain's voice came over the intercom, low, smooth, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Chicago O'Hare. Local time is 9:47 a.m. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The familiar sounds followed, clicks of buckles, shifting bodies, bags tucked under seats. It was the beginning of the end, of the flight, of the moment, and, for Amelia, of the person she'd been just 2 hours before. She sat upright, hands still in her lap. But the tension that had once locked her shoulders had softened. Not gone, but different, more honest. She looked at Omari, who hadn't spoken again. He was calm, reading once more, as if nothing had happened. But Amelia knew something had, because she wasn't the same. She turned toward the window, watching the clouds thin as the city appeared below. Grid lines of neighborhoods, tiny squares of houses, a river threading its way through steel and history. All of it felt smaller now, and somehow more sacred. She thought about her daughter, how often she'd tried to bring this up, how many dinners ended in tight-lipped silences, how many times Amelia had called herself realistic when what she meant was that she was afraid. But fear doesn't excuse harm, and silence doesn't undo it. She didn't know how to make it right, not wholly, but she knew the worst thing she could do was leave that plane unchanged. The plane tilted gently, wheels unfolding beneath them. Omari shifted to close his book. Amelia glanced at him one more time, not expecting anything. He didn't meet her eyes, but he didn't need to. Some truths don't need repeating. They need to be remembered. The runway came into view. A smooth stretch of concrete is rushing closer. The plane trembled slightly, then steadied. And as the tires kissed the earth again, so did she. The cabin doors opened with a soft hiss, and the line of passengers began to shuffle forward, one aisle at a time. Amelia stood with the rest, her bag already in hand. She could feel the weight of it, but it wasn't what was pulling her down. What pulled was the choice. She could walk out, keep her head forward and her eyes ahead. Just another traveler, tired from the flight. She could disappear into the terminal noise, grab a cab, and tell herself, at least you apologized. At least you didn't double down. That voice was familiar. It had protected her for years. Please don't make a big deal out of it. Let it go. She stepped off the plane. The terminal greeted her with chaos. Families reuniting, suits walking with purpose, announcements echoing across wide walls. She blended in. She was almost gone. Almost. And then she stopped. She hadn't meant to. Her feet just did. She turned around. There, just behind her, Omari padded. Alone, bag over shoulder, calm as ever. She stepped aside, waited. When he neared, she turned to him entirely, for once, not rehearsed. I didn't say it right on the plane, she said. And maybe I never will. But I see it now. What I was part of. What I nearly did. I don't expect you to forgive that. But I needed you to know. I won't forget. Omari didn't speak for a moment. Then he offered the faintest nod. Not approved. Just acknowledgement. You saw it, he said. That's a start. Then he kept walking. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. Because this time, she wasn't running away from anything. She had finally chosen to stand still, long enough to face what was hers. Omari disappeared into the moving crowd. No applause, headline, or confrontation. Just a man heading to baggage claim. Just another Tuesday. Amelia stood still for a few moments longer, then finally turned to go. Her bag felt lighter now, not because anything had been removed, but because something had been unpacked inside her. She didn't rush. As she walked toward the terminal exit, she passed a mother with her teenage son. He was tall, black, wearing a backpack and earbuds, swaying gently to music only he could hear. The mother gently pulled his hoodie down as they approached the security guard. It was the smallest gesture. But in that moment, it hit Amelia like a wave. That had been her once. her hand, her daughter. She paused, watched them walk, wondered how many times she'd reached for protection, and instead handed down a lesson in fear. She exhaled slowly, stepped forward again. This time, she didn't look away. Outside, the city waited. Cold wind, bright sun, horns and voices layered like music. Life is moving fast. But for Amelia Jones, something had slowed. Something inside her had finally stopped long enough to be seen, named, and, maybe one day, changed. Not erased, not undone, but interrupted. And sometimes, that's enough. Fade to black. If stories like this matter to you, stories that stir something more profound, that make us look twice at ourselves, don't just scroll. What happened on that flight wasn't a scene. It wasn't a scandal. It was something quieter and far more common. This story isn't about a woman who made a mistake. It's about what she chose to do after seeing it. That's the objective measure of who we are. Not perfection, not always knowing, but whether we're brave enough to pause, turn around, and face the part of ourselves we were too polite to confront. So now the question becomes, what will you do the next time? Will you speak up? Will you examine your instincts? Will you stop the story before it becomes a headline? If this story made you pause, if it stirred something you haven't named yet, don't scroll past it. Sit with it, share it, and talk about it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe stories like this matter, real stories that challenge and change us, then subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below. Please tell us what part hit you hardest or made you stop and think. Because the world doesn't change through silence. It changes when we choose to keep listening. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay honest, and may your next flight, whatever it takes you, bring you closer to your destination and the person you most want to be. Wishing you peace, awareness, and a day filled with kindness. We'll see you in the following story.